This video is sponsored by Ground News, who have a special deal to offer to viewers of my channel. Stick around to hear more about it. At the time of this video's release, Israel is massacring massive numbers of Palestinians in an indiscriminate bombing campaign of civilian buildings in the Gaza Strip, with at least 7,000 being killed in just the last few weeks at the time of recording, including at least 3,000 children. They have forcibly displaced 1.4 million Palestinians in this same time frame in an ethnic cleansing campaign that eclipses any other in modern history. It even eclipses Israel's first ethnic cleansing campaign, the 1948 Nakba, where the Israelis forced around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and never allowed them to return. Many of those ethnically cleansed people were pushed into the very Gaza Strip that Israel is presently destroying. To be able to carry out such atrocities and get away with them, Israel needs a lot of external support in practically every sphere. Military support, funding, diplomatic cover, propaganda cover, trade deals, and more. And this support is provided to it by Western countries. The very same Western countries that love to paint themselves as morally superior defenders of human rights, who have the self-appointed right to police the rest of the world. The most important among them being the USA, European Union, and UK. Yet despite the long history of atrocities committed by Israel against Palestinians, despite its endless flouting of international law and UN resolutions, despite it being a blatant and open occupier and racial supremacist ethno-state, and despite its latest, even more murderous onslaught against the Palestinian people, it still gets almost unconditional support from the West. As Israel massacres what will no doubt become tens of thousands of Palestinians in its worst campaign of mass killing yet, the reaction of the Western Bloc countries has not been to denounce these clear and obvious Israeli atrocities, and definitely not to do anything about them. It was not even just to ignore them and try to sweep them under the rug. It was, rather, to justify them and double down on their support for Israel. The USA immediately moved to send Israel billions of dollars in military aid so that it could buy more weapons to keep destroying Gaza and murdering Palestinian children. Western leaders rushed to visit Israel to express their full solidarity with the overtly fascist Netanyahu government, sharing laughs with the man and his cronies, while their military carries out what is already one of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, just 50 miles away. And back at home, expressing opposition to Israel's latest ethnic cleansing and murder campaign has become borderline criminal in some of these Western nations, and actually criminal in others. Meanwhile, the Western media dutifully complies with their government's official line, always treating Israel with the softest kid's gloves imaginable, reciting its propaganda as if it's fact, trying to frame its murders, its ethnic cleansing campaigns, its colonialism, and its dispossession of the Palestinian people as if it's like just everyday business, and of course, doing just about everything possible to invert reality and try to paint the Israelis as actually the victims of their victims. But why? Why have Western nations so unequivocally supported Israel for so long, despite its clear and obvious criminality, despite the fact that its atrocities far eclipse those of other actors that the West has not at all been hesitant to denounce? Why does the West have such an unflinching compromise with the Israeli settler state? That is the question that I'm going to be answering in this video. With all this bias in the mainstream media, and especially on this topic, it's hard to know who's telling the truth or pushing a narrative for profit, which can make it difficult to form a well-rounded perspective. Luckily, there's a tool that you can use to help with this. Ground News is an independent app and website that compiles thousands of local and international sources into one place, so you can compare coverage. We already know that there's many Western sources reporting on Israel-Palestine, and Ground News also gives us access to local sources that are translated for us, so we can have a better understanding of this issue. To give you an example, recently there was a bit of a spat between the Israeli ambassador to the UN and the UN Secretary General. If you were to rely on just a single news website, you'd be vulnerable to being swayed by whatever narrative that they might want to push about it. This can often be subtle, with them picking and choosing what to emphasize and de-emphasize, or what to include and omit. Things that you might otherwise never notice if you didn't look further into the story. However, Ground News offers you quick and easy access to a much broader perspective. For the story in question, it provides over 75 different articles, and you can see here that it has assessed most of these outlets as leaning right, telling us that this story might be a bit more sensationalized. It also provides key insights into what media outlets with different biases are saying about the issue. Ground News does this for us in 3 quick bullet points with the comparison tool, and if we look deeper into the articles themselves, we can check for ownership, factuality, and bias of the source. For example, The Independent, tagged as left-leaning with high factuality, says, Israel vows to teach UN a lesson in row over Hamas attack comments, while La Nación, labeled as right with high factuality, states, strong rejection in Israel against the head of the UN. They call for his resignation. It's the same story, but with different language. Left-leaning outlets tend to say vow, while the right uses words like rejection and resignation, which sensationalize the story a bit more. You should always maintain a critical eye and be diligent about the media that you're consuming, and Ground News is a great tool that can help you to do exactly that. You'll be a lot better informed if you use it to assess news stories for yourself than you would otherwise be just reading 1 or 2 media outlets or trying to sift through all the different outlets on your own. That's why I recommend you give it a try. Go to ground.news/badempanada or click the link in the description to check it out for yourself. By subscribing through my link, you can get an exclusive 30% off discount on an unlimited access subscription to Ground News. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out. Now, on with the rest of the video. It can seem intuitive to look at this situation and conclude that Israel is somehow manipulating other countries and the mainstream media into supporting it. Even former US President Donald Trump once expressed such a sentiment.
Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them to see the evil doings of Israel.
This is the explanation that a sizable number of people turn to, including some Palestinians. And who can blame them? When you've been expelled from your home, your family members massacred, your basic rights denied, yet you nonetheless see your victimizer getting such overwhelming geopolitical support and positive mass media coverage, while your very existence is demonized, it's gonna come naturally to think that something like that might be happening. But this isn't the case. For one, this explanation assumes that Israel's international backers are otherwise morally good, and would thus need to be manipulated into supporting morally reprehensible things. This only makes sense if we take at face value the West's own narrative about its motivations in geopolitics being to spread human rights, democracy, freedom, and other such buzzwords. We'd also need to ignore the long list of atrocities of these countries, such as their own colonialism and modern history of interventions, which often include backing far-right dictatorships and waging wars so intense that they destroy entire countries, kill millions, and ruin the lives of tens of millions more. So, quite simply, it really just doesn't make sense to think that they'd need to be manipulated into supporting a criminal state like Israel, because they themselves do similar stuff all the time. It's just giving them way too much credit. More importantly though, Israel is clearly far less powerful in every conceivable way than states like the US, UK, and a bloc like the EU. It's simply not possible that a relatively small state with a relatively small population could somehow manipulate so many much more powerful allies, including the world's richest state and its foremost superpower. Israel is clearly the one who's reliant and dependent on these countries. It holds practically no power over them. This is different to the West's relationship with a much more independent state like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a much bigger country than Israel, with a much bigger population, substantial influence over its neighbors, and immense power over the global economy due to its oil reserves. Saudi Arabia, while certainly not nearly as powerful of a country as the USA, is still nonetheless strong in its own right in spite of its relationship with the US. It is a regional power with real leverage in one of the world's most important commodity markets, and thus is able to at times coerce the USA into supporting it more than the US would perhaps like to. So the US supports the imperialist regional ambitions of the Saudis, turns a blind eye to their funding of terrorism, including on its own shores, and treats them with kids' gloves regarding the fact that they're an abhorrent, brutal, dictatorial monarchy, and in return the Saudis cooperate with the USA's own imperialist regional ambitions and wreak way less havoc on the global oil market than they otherwise could. That is much more of an arrangement between a relatively independent power and a much stronger world power, while the USA's relationship with Israel is that of a major imperial power and a proxy state that is completely reliant on its relationship with the US and other imperial powers to even exist. Additionally, it's important to understand that there is a long history of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that claim that Jews with nefarious aims are secretly pulling the strings and manipulating global affairs from behind the scenes. Most of those who claim that Israel manipulates its backers don't mean to be anti-Semitic, and are merely drawing the wrong conclusions in an earnest attempt to try and make sense of how such an abhorrent, genocidal state can get so much support from nations that outwardly claim to be on the side of human rights and justice. But regardless of the intent, regardless of how one arrived to have such an opinion, expressing an idea like this, which sounds similar to one of the most widespread and damaging anti-Semitic tropes, is incorrect, could potentially lead to actual anti-Semitism, and gives ammo to pro-Israel propagandists. They love to jump on any opportunity to smear anyone who is opposed to Israel and its oppression of the Palestinians for any reason, with anti-Semitism allegations, and thus constantly try to spin literally anything into being anti-Semitic. So you can bet they'll be ready and willing to jump down the throat of anyone who gives them a layup by making a mistake like this. So then, if not this, then what's the actual reason that the West backs Israel so unflinchingly? Is it a love for democratic values and respect for human rights? Is it a love for the Jewish people? A term which, if you ask Israel and its allies, they consider practically synonymous with the Israeli state? I'm going to defer to an expert on this matter who can very succinctly explain the real reason to you. The President of the USA at the time of recording this video, Joe Biden.
Even as circumstances have changed, one thing has not: our deep commitment to the security of the State of Israel. That has not changed. That will not change as long as I and he are President and Vice President of the United States. It's in our naked self-interest, beyond the moral imperative.
I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel. I am with my colleagues who are on the floor in the Foreign Relations Committee, and we worry at length about NATO. And we worry about the eastern flank of NATO, Greece and Turkey, and how important it is. They pale by comparison. May I have one more minute, I ask my colleague?
The Senator's time has expired. Would you care to yield additional time?
One more minute, 60 seconds.
Without objection.
They pale by comparison in terms of the benefit that accrues to the United States of America.
Straight from the horse's mouth. The USA backs Israel solely because US politicians have calculated that it's simply in the naked self-interest of their country to do so. It has absolutely nothing with any of the justifications that you're more likely to hear at press conferences, like democracy or whatever. According to Biden, this unflinching self-interest results in an amazing return on investment, one that eclipses what the USA gets out of any of its other alliances. So much so that if Israel did not exist, the USA would have to intervene and invent another nation that could play the same role for it in the Middle East. It has nothing to do with the oft-stated post-hoc justifications like Israel being necessary for the Jewish people, or even with Jewish people at all. They don't care about them, obviously. If Palestine had instead been colonized by Mormons or Peruvians or Albanians, the West would be supporting the resulting settler state all the same, provided that they played the same regional role that Israel does. Now, when Biden talks about US self-interest, he's not really referring to the interests of average Americans. They probably don't really get much out of the oppression of the Palestinians by Israel. What he really means is that it suits the interests of the corporations of the US and their allies. How does supporting Israel do this? Well, it's kinda simple, really. Through keeping the Middle East divided. And that was always the plan, even of the people who went on to found Israel themselves. The Zionist movement that would go on to found the State of Israel saw themselves as a bastion of European civilization against Eastern barbarism, just as they still do today. This antagonistic mentality would not be taken too very kindly by the so-called barbaric Eastern people who already lived in the land that they planned to colonize, nor by its neighbors, And the Zionists knew that. The neighboring Arab states were always going to react poorly to them supplanting the land of Palestine and expelling its population. So the early Zionists had already correctly surmised that the very existence of their planned state in Palestine could only be guaranteed through the support of the larger imperial powers, which they would get by being a willing proxy for their interests in the region. Theodor Herzl was the founder of Zionism, the colonial movement that would later go on to found the State of Israel. By 1896, he'd already proposed that the future Zionist state would be a mere proxy state, a dependent outpost of the Western colonial powers that would further their interests in exchange for their backing, exactly what ended up happening. He wrote, "We should form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence." It's important to talk about the Israel lobby before moving on to the many ways in which the support of Israel benefits Western geopolitical interests. This lobby, which is prevalent throughout the West, but particularly strong in the US and the UK, is a symptom rather than a cause. It's been nurtured to promote and ensure support for a country that is seen as vital to Western interests in the Middle East, rather than itself being the root of said support. The Israel lobby does not dictate Western foreign policy, and a lobby group representing a relatively small state could never even remotely do something like that in the first place. Rather, the Israel lobby is allowed to exist and is allowed to be powerful, specifically because its interests are aligned with US foreign policy and the naked self-interest of the US state and its corporations. It's as Jonah Boyarin wrote in Jewish Currents. While the Israel lobby encourages and nurtures this strategic relationship, the relationship has a logic of its own, stemming from the self-interested worldview of Washington foreign policy professionals and predating the role of organizations like AIPAC. Now, here's some of the big ways in which Western interests in the Middle East are served through its support of Israel. The Middle East is an incredibly important region. It's smack bang in the middle of everything, linking Europe, Africa, and Asia, and it's incredibly rich in natural resources, especially oil. It's very useful for the Western powers to have an antagonistic proxy state at such a key strategic location in the Middle East, splitting the region up at the only overland crossing from Egypt to the Arabian Peninsula. This ensures that nothing that could potentially rival the Western imperial powers can ever form in the region. Not any sort of Middle Eastern superstate or union between states, nor a broader regional alliance. That Israel's utility to its backers is specifically derived from it being antagonistic to its neighbors means that its utility to its backers is also necessarily derived from its military strength. The West, and the US in particular, benefit greatly from this. Israel-related divisions, such as the recent push by Washington for Middle Eastern countries to normalize relations with Israel, cause massive issues in regional politics, ensuring a constant political chaos that renders any possibility of a united front against Western hegemony in the region ever forming impossible. When military action is carried out by Israel instead of by these Western allies directly, it also makes it much easier to spin as something legitimate and local, rather than as bog-standard Western imperialism. For example, Israel intervened in the Lebanese civil war on the side of pro-Western Christian fascists against more anti-Western nationalist factions. Israel also crucially keeps its neighbors in check for the West, particularly Egypt and Syria. Egypt used to be a leader in the non-aligned movement, with pan-Arab, anti-Western nationalist groups being in power for a long time, and they proved to be quite a thorn in the side of the West. But now, after multiple wars with Israel, and one directly against Western countries, who were of course joined by Israel, Egypt has gradually been forced into line, and its government has turned from being a constant thorn in the side of Western interests in the region into something of an unofficial lackey for the West. And right now, Israel and the US are of course on the same side in the ongoing Syrian civil war, with both of them carrying out frequent airstrikes and providing money, arms, and training to rebel groups. Israel's constant wars and its oppression of the Palestinians provide a valuable testing ground and market for the Western arms industry. Israel uses Palestinians as lab rats for oppression. It tests surveillance technology and weaponry on them, providing opportunities for so-called battle testing, which otherwise might not exist for the corporations that produce such goods. Technology, techniques, and training are then exported throughout the West, and then often employed against protesters at home. Israel also frequently acts as a proxy for the West in situations where public opinion at home makes their more direct involvement less politically feasible, helping out the US's most unsavory allies with weapons, military training, and support. When the USA wanted to help the Guatemalan military while it was carrying out a genocide of indigenous people, it turned to Israel for help, who of course duly obliged, sending substantial military support. When it became too much of a PR disaster for Western countries to continue to openly support South Africa, Israel stepped in and sent it weapons. And when even the US Congress was against further US government funding of the far-right Contra insurgency in Nicaragua, Israel stepped in for the USA, training them and sending them the arms and equipment that they needed to keep their death squad massacres going. Israel's intelligence services also act as a proxy for Western interests in the region, cooperating with them intimately and carrying out operations that are very useful to Western interests, such as international assassinations against Western geopolitical opponents. Recently, this is happening particularly in Iran. These actions would likely cause diplomatic and domestic political turmoil if the West had carried them out directly and then it came to light, which has happened many times in the past. However, such actions are so normal for Israel to do that they're pretty much just expected of it, and thus they tend to get far less attention, and sometimes they even go entirely unnoticed outside of the countries that they do them to. And that's just some of it. There's way more, but I can't cover everything in just a short video. In summary, Israel projects military power and causes geopolitical chaos, meaning that the Western countries need to do far less of those things themselves, which saves them tons of resources, tons of effort, and lots of bad PR. It also makes these things much easier to sell to domestic and international audiences than they would otherwise be, if they had to do them themselves. This greatly serves their interests in the Middle East, overall allowing their corporations much better access to its resources, markets, and everything else. And that's all they care about. Regardless of what they say, there is no moral element to it. The appeals to morality and human rights and freedom and democracy and whatever are all post hoc PR plays. It's bullshit. The reality is that they simply have far more to gain from supporting Israel than they would ever have from meaningfully challenging the Israeli oppression of Palestinians. Sometimes, though, Israel's attacks on Palestinians are so intense that they become impossible even for the Western-aligned media to ignore, and so the heat on Israel's backers goes up. The reaction of the West to this is always just to pay token lip service to the plight of the Palestinians, and pretend to give Israel a stern talking to, while nonetheless continuing to full-throatedly support Israel in every actual meaningful way. Outwardly, they may claim to be against the problem, like Israeli occupation, Israeli oppression of Palestinians, etc., yet they give Israel their full-throated support at all times. So they're the only thing that is keeping the cause of the problem going, the only thing preventing its resolution. The West doesn't want to push any real solution, like for example forcing the Israelis to concede to a one-state solution of a secular democracy with equal rights for all, because such a state would finally become an actual part of the region rather than be antagonistic to it, and would therefore no longer be such a great servant to Western interest as Israel is. They don't care how many bombs Israel drops on Palestinian kids, because Palestinian kids are not useful to them and Israel is. So when it comes time for them to choose between the two, they're always going to choose to send Israel billions of dollars so that it can bomb those kids better. That's the sad truth of it. Without the material, diplomatic, and propaganda backing of the imperial powers who prop Israel up, its days of oppressing the Palestinian people would be numbered. It is a paper tiger that would quickly be forced into ending its crimes if it were faced with real international pressure, if it were sanctioned, boycotted, and turned into the pariah state that it deserves to be, without the shielding of the Western Bloc. So it may be completely and utterly depressing that Israel enjoys such unconditional backing in its colonial oppression by the world's most powerful geopolitical bloc, which includes the world's #1 military and economic superpower. But the fact that Israel is dependent on this support does at least mean that those of us who are from the countries that back Israel have a very clear means of fighting against it. One that wouldn't exist if the alternative explanation of Israel somehow being strong enough to manipulate the world's most powerful countries into supporting it were actually true. Taking action at home. Since the West's propping up of Israel, and thus its support of Israel's oppression of the Palestinians, is entirely based around a nakedly self-interested cost-benefit analysis, that means it's possible for us to make this cost too much to be worth maintaining. Protest, advocate, explain things to others, and bring them on board. Every individual who decides to say that enough is enough and take action strengthens the movement and drives it closer towards reaching a critical mass where the political costs at home outweigh the geopolitical benefits that Western governments derive from supporting and covering for the criminal state of Israel. And once that finally happens, the sanctions, the boycotts, the diplomatic pressure, and hell, perhaps even arms shipments to the Palestinian resistance will soon come. It worked with apartheid South Africa, and it could work here. It might take a while, but it's really the least that we could do for the oppressed and brutalized Palestinian people, given what our governments do to them in our names. It's practically impossible for Israel to win the propaganda war nowadays, given the prevalence of the internet and social media. Israel's crimes are plain for all to see, and Western governments and their obedient mainstream media, despite their best efforts, simply aren't able to cover for them even close to as well as they did 20 or even 10 years ago, when they had near complete control over the dissemination of information. The tides are turning, and it's up for us to take advantage of this by making and expanding movements for the liberation of Palestine, until they can no longer simply be suppressed or ignored. Being in the belly of the beast means that you can hit the belly, and if you care at all about justice, about other human beings, if you aren't a ghoul who supports oppression, ethno-nationalism, colonialism, or fascism, then it is your duty to do so for Palestine. Thanks very much for watching this video. If you liked it and you want to see more, subscribe to my channel. And if you really liked it, you could send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi as thanks, or you could head on over to my Patreon or Ko-fi page and become a member. Membership tiers come with various benefits, such as, for example, being in these here credits that you're watching now. Now I'd just like to thank all of my supporters, and especially my $25 plus supporters: Jel Cribson, Mischief and Fins, Brosnan, Aizmalad, William Tomlinson, Arthur Simak Jones, RoboCommy, Exos, Stephen Jordan, Milton Friedman, Qualia, Mlog, Jacob Tran, Ron Wing, Geordie, and my $10 plus supporters: Wesley Potts, JG, Lee Fiorine, Christian Cornels, Melissa Gomez, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Justin Bailey 77, Empire in Focus, Ugopnik, Nabiru, B, Theo Katsaros, Johnny Rocket, Firefox 42, Happy Nephron, Minijan, Eric Perkins, Ant, Max Halland, Ting Ting, Jack Paul, Sir Splendid, Big Man, Shona, Kieran Goodwin, Stephen Richardson, and Mira. That's all for now. See you next time.